The company's pitch is that they'll bring jobs, technological innovation, and a boost to Canada's overall economic output. But the company in question isn't just any company. It's the Chinese tech giant Huawei, a major player at the heart of current tensions between Ottawa and Beijing. Here with the pitch for why his company should be part of bringing 5G service to Canada, Alykhan Velshi. He is Vice President, Corporate Affairs at Huawei Canada, and it's nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just start with this. How big is your presence in Canada today?
So Huawei's been in Canada since 2008. We have 1,200 employees growing, mostly in Ontario, but spread out across the entire country.
And you've got relationships, I gather, with 17 Canadian universities worth $56 million. What is all that for?
Yeah, the number varies. I think 17 is sort of the latest number. It sort of circulates around 20. And we've probably spent around $50 million in the last 10 years on various forms of academic partnerships.
And whatever emerges from those partnerships, who has the intellectual property on that?
So in terms of our agreements that we sign right now, the researchers in those universities have the ability to commercialize the research. The patents tend to be shared between Huawei and the university, and how the universities allocate those rights is largely up to them.
There's a great debate in the country right now, well, around the world, about 5G technology and who ought to be allowed to participate in that. And why don't we really start from scratch here?
Sure.
What's 5G?
So 5G is the next stage of the evolution from 4G LTE. So if you were to turn on your phone right now, it would say LTE on it. That's a 4G connection, right? 1G would have been the old sort of handsets that Zach Morris would have had in Saved by the Bell. 2G is what let you send sort of text messages for the first time. 3G lets you send emails and surf the internet. 4G is what sort of enables this Apple iPhone ecosystem of Uber and sort of the sharing economy. So 5G is the next stage. And so what makes 5G unique is that it offers sort of three things. It offers higher speeds, so you can kind of download a movie faster. It offers lower latency. What that means is it means that the kind of the communications you do go from taking place in a few milliseconds to even fewer than that. So it actually enables technologies like autonomous vehicles, remote surgeries, and things like that. And then lastly, it offers sort of higher throughput, which is just another way of enabling different aspects of sort of the economy beyond sort of our ability to download movies fast.
So it is the cat's pajamas for whatever's coming next.
I think that's right. I think I think people tend to exaggerate some of the benefits of 5G. Like I would say that it will be a game changer. It won't be a game changer right away, but certainly as countries adopt 5G, as operators start rolling it out, we will find that more and more of our of processes that we sort of had become used to being kind of analog, become connected and digital.
As we suggested in the intro, Alykhan, you work for a very successful company, but it's no ordinary company because it is in the middle, of course, of some pretty significant geopolitics right now. And Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this graphic up here. This is from a recent national poll done by researchers at the University of British Columbia. And we'll just roll down these numbers here. 58% of Canadians surveyed have an unfavorable view of China. 55% say cyber attacks and espionage are among the top concerns regarding China's growing presence in Canada. 50% of Canadians think it would be a mistake to allow Huawei to be a major provider to Canada's 5G system. 43%, so that's the biggest chunk of Canadians, 43% feel Huawei research and development investment in Canada should be encouraged. 35% are calling for a full ban of Huawei in Canada. What do you take from those numbers?
I mean, certain parts are encouraging, certain parts are kind of causes for anxiety. I think that what we try to do is provide more public education, both about what Huawei does in Canada currently. I think most Canadians, frankly, are surprised to learn that we've even been here since 2008, but also to make sure that Canadians know the sort of the benefits that openness to investments from foreign companies brings to Canada, how we're a trading economy, how we can't just sort of build up walls around our country and expect to thrive economically.
Here's a quote I'm going to read to you from the U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. He had this to say at the Halifax Security Forum recently. He said, "The Huawei Trojan horse is frightening. It's terrifying. When they get Huawei into Canada through 5G or other Western countries, they're going to know every health record, every banking record, every social media post. They're going to know everything about every single Canadian. I find it amazing that our allies and friends in other liberal democracies would allow Huawei in." Your view?
I think it's galling, and I think it's inappropriate. I think it's galling because, frankly, decisions about technology should be made based on technology, not based on politics. They should be made in Canada, not based on bullying from the United States. But it also just reveals a certain ignorance on his part. Huawei exists in the United States. In fact, Huawei has provided network equipment to rural carriers throughout the United States. The same week that President Trump sent his officials to Canada to threaten to try to bully Canada into blocking Huawei, they were busy granting exemptions to allow U.S. companies to conduct limited business with Huawei. So I think that that gentleman is sort of talking out of both sides of his mouth. But I think the most important thing I want to emphasize is that what we do is we sell network equipment to operators like Rogers, like Bell, like TELUS. And ultimately, they deploy the equipment in their networks. They're the ones who fundamentally decide, who control the information of their customers. None of that passes through Huawei's hands. So it just reveals a certain ignorance about how these technologies work. Right?
Here's the difference, though, of course. None of those companies that you just mentioned is owned by an authoritarian government run by the Communist Party. A Chinese statute enacted in 2017 states that all Chinese companies must, quote, support, cooperate with, and collaborate in national intelligence work. There's nothing ambiguous about that, Alykhan, and I wonder, how does that not mean that whatever information Huawei would get in Canada if it got the 5G contract, how does that not mean that they would not then therefore be obligated to turn over that information to the Chinese state?
So I want to address that in a few different parts and kind of in a somewhat detailed way. So the first thing is Huawei Canada, which is obviously the subsidiary of Huawei globally, is a Canadian company, and the only laws that apply to Huawei Canada are the laws of Canada. So whether it's our president, Eric, whether it's me, whether it's our CTO, Rob, whether it's an engineer beavering away in a cubicle, the only laws that apply to us are the laws of Canada. And the laws of Canada on these sorts of subjects are pretty clear. Secondly, customers' data never passes through sort of our networks or our hands, right? We sell equipment into the radio access network, the sort of the cell phone towers of the Rogers, the Bells, the Teluses, and so on. We don't sell equipment to them where there's customer data that passes into that equipment. And so they control the customer data, we don't. The third thing is, this national security law. I tend to hear about this national security law, from the media and in articles because it is completely irrelevant to my lived experience as a Huawei Canada employee. But these laws were on the books when, or similar laws were on the books when Huawei first came into Canada back in 2008. So many of the sort of the criticisms and the complaints that get raised now, they're not necessarily new. They were in the minds of decision makers in 2008 when Canadian officials decided to let Huawei in the first place. And all that's happened since 2008 and today, this 11-year track record of Huawei in Canada, is that we've operated in Canada without a single incident, without a single complaint from any of our customers, from any of the cybersecurity agencies. So we actually now have a track record of success.
I wonder, though, whether, and things are a little dicey right now between Canada and China as it relates to the government-to-government relationship, if head office were to put pressure on Huawei Canada saying, we could sure use your help with some information right now because things are very ticklish with the Trudeau government, and you've got some information that would be very helpful, how would your company say no to that?
Well, first of all, we would refuse it. But even more deeply than that, we've already said we would refuse it. So our founder, Mr. Ren, in China, so he's not in Canada, he's in China, he's been asked on a number of occasions how he would respond to a sort of a hypothetical request. And he said he would refuse it. And he's explained why he would refuse it and how he would refuse it. So the manner in which he would refuse it is, he sought legal advice on sort of the laws in China, from law firms and from, I think, Clifford Chance in China. And their opinion is that he would have the legal ability to refuse it. But even more beyond that, he sort of explained from a dollars and cents perspective how it would never make commercial sense for Huawei to ever agree to that because it's a company most of whose revenues doesn't come from China anymore. So he has said that if Huawei were to ever get entangled in some sort of sordid business of that nature, it would stop being a global company that operates in 180 countries, and it would just become a Chinese company that operates in one country alone, and he would never let that happen to his company. So that's sort of the global perspective. From the Canadian perspective, as I said, all of our employees in Canada, from our president on down, have to follow Canadian laws and Canadian laws alone. And those sorts of requests, were they to be made, would clearly be in violation of Canadian law. And anyone who would dare to even kind of think of complying with it would be violating the actual rules here and would face a fairly significant penalty.
What if Justin Trudeau were just to say, you know what, I can have the same good technology with Ericsson from Sweden or Nokia from Finland, and I don't have to deal with any of the geopolitical BS that comes along with it? Why shouldn't he make that decision?
Look, I'm not going to get into the details of the government of Canada's review and its process, other than to say that, our perspective is that decisions of this nature should be made based on technology, not politics, right? It should be made by engineers and those who are actually experts in network and actually understand how these things work. But I think more broadly, one of the points that the Canadian telecom operators have made is that this is a small market, right? There's Huawei, there's Ericsson, there's Nokia, maybe Samsung and a few others on the radio access network side. And to go from a market of 3 to a market of 2 will massively increase not just cell phone prices for customers in terms of them having to pass on their cost to customers or to their shareholders, but will actually delay 5G deployment in Canada, just as had Huawei not been permitted into Canada in 2008, 4G LTE deployment would have been significantly delayed. And so, we will leave it to the government of Canada to go through their processes and make their decision, and we're happy to offer any reassurances they need. But I think one of the things that they will have to be weighing is the effect of the decisions they make on sort of the lived experience for Canadians as people who are frankly connected to the internet.
I know you're the Huawei Canada guy, but I do want to ask you a question about Home Office.
Sure.
Do you know whether or not any Huawei technology has been used to survey ethnic minorities, many of whom are in, for example, detention camps or that kind of thing in China?
I've read I think the same stories that you have. There's not much, frankly, that I'm able to say, for the simple reason that Huawei operates in 180 countries, and I really only have line of sight into Canada, right? Don't really have line of sight into the other 179 countries. But what I can say is that, when we sell technology to operators, and it's operators that deploy it, and when we talk about kind of smart cities and sort of some of the technology related to that, we don't operate smart cities technology on behalf of our customers. They sort of do it. And so the analogy that I think our founder has given, Mr. Wren, has been that it's sort of like a truck, right? Like we sell the truck, and it's the person who drives the truck that decides what they put in the truck. But we don't really have line of sight into that, and certainly I in Huawei Canada have zero line of sight into things sort of half a world away.
Okay, let's do something a little closer to home. You know, of course, that the CFO, the daughter of the founder, is, I guess, out on bail, house arrest in Vancouver, arrested a year ago for allegedly violating U.S. trade sanctions. Are you in touch with her?
I'm not sort of directly in contact with her. She's represented by counsel. I've obviously met her, but I think one of the interesting sort of developments on that file, and certainly that's something that that I was. I'm not sure if I was actually just in China over the weekend. One of the things that I was briefing them on over there, in terms of the Canadian developments, was a Globe and Mail story on the period leading up to her arrest and some of the events that happened in the period leading up to her arrest. In particular, what I consider to be highly inappropriate involvement of Trump national security officials like John Bolton, and which has always sort of reinforced the view that we've had that her detention has been a very politicized detention.
I'm going to call that very ironic, because my bet is you and John Bolton agree on everything as it relates to geopolitics in the world right now, but you've got this new role, I understand. But that is passing strange, don't you think?
No, look, I think that, John Bolton has a range of inflammatory foreign policy views. The way I described it, and you may appreciate this, is if you think of everything that we like about Bill Davis, right? The sobriety, the compassion, the moderation, the pragmatism. John Bolton is the opposite of every of those things.
Yes, he is.
He is the opposite of what we hold dearest in Canadian values, and to have him identified by the Globe and Mail as having brought about this outcome, having boxed Canada in, having put Canada into this uncomfortable place of being caught between President Trump and China in this trade war, I think this is something that that's reinforced what we've said all along, and it's something that I think a lot of Canadians are going to be very anxious about.
Let's do one more question on this before we talk a little politics, and that is, we see how Madame Meng is being treated in British Columbia, and we see how the two Michaels are being treated in China, and it's appalling, and it's very, very different. Why should we be doing business with that kind of regime?
Look, I think that you talked about the two Michaels. Like, we're concerned. I think all Canadians are concerned by what we're seeing, and ultimately, this is a problem that governments and diplomats need to resolve, right? So it's not for sort of tech executives to resolve, and we hope that they can resolve this as soon as possible. In terms of the broader Canada-China relationship, I think we just want to see relations back on track. I think China is our third biggest trading partner after the United States. We can't be forever in this period of tension with our third biggest trading partners. Canada, we're a trading country, and so how those tensions get resolved is ultimately something that governments and diplomats will have to figure out. But certainly, my position, and I think Huawei Canada's position, is that we just want to see relations back on track.
Okay. Just so everybody knows, I am not ambushing our guest here with these questions I'm about to ask. I did give you the heads up ahead of time because you used to be Patrick Brown's chief of staff when he was the leader of the Ontario PC Party at Queen's Park, and I haven't seen you since all of that went down. That's a year and a half ago already, and I did want to have a chance, just in our remaining few moments here, to kind of clear up the record and put a few things to you from back in the day. I think we all remember that January night, a year and a half ago, well, almost 2 years ago now, when some allegations about sexual misconduct came out about Patrick Brown. He went to the microphones to give a press conference. It did not go well. He was chased out of the building to a car. From what he says in his book, you and two other backroom people sent him out to do that press conference. You assured him that you would be there for him when the press conference was over. Instead, apparently, he says the three of you tweeted out your resignations and left him hanging. Your view.
That's a fabrication. It's a total fabrication. So we did not recommend he do that news conference. In fact, we had offered our resignation to his campaign manager several hours before that news conference. And so that's just totally not true.
It's totally not true?
It is completely untrue that we recommended that he do that news conference.
You suggested he not do the news conference?
Yes.
So he went out and did it on his own, in your view?
I mean, he has a number of advisors, and I'm sure that after we had left, a number of people were helping him, do that. But the advice that we had offered him was that he should resign. And when he failed to take that advice, we notified the campaign chair that we would be resigning.
So when he left that press conference all by himself to go down to the car and take him away, we should therefore not be surprised that you as his chief of staff were not by his side.
That's right. I had probably left an hour or two beforehand.
Okay. He also says that, and this is, I think, an even tougher criticism. He says that once he was no longer the leader, you led a kind of a black ops campaign against him to discredit him so that he couldn't try to either maintain the leadership or run for it again after he'd stepped down. He says you got a hold of his passwords to look through his private records on his Queen's Park computers. You told staff to look for dirt on his friends and family. Again, I should give you a chance to comment on that.
It just seems totally conspiratorial. I don't have his passwords. I've never had his passwords. It's difficult to comment on a book I haven't read, but from what I've been sort of told about the book, it strikes me as a mix of exaggeration and fabrication, and that particular one I would put in the fabrication box, not the exaggeration box.
You never had his passwords?
I've never had his passwords.
As his chief of staff for his computers, you never had his passwords?
No. Why would I have anyone's passwords but my own?
Okay. You haven't read the book, eh?
I have not read the book.
Now, have you not read the book just so you could sit here and tell an interviewer someday, I haven't read the book, and therefore, how can you not want to read a book that's so much of which is about you?
I've seen it in chapters. Frankly, I've thought about picking it up, and then I realized I have better things to do with my day.
After you left Patrick Brown's employ, you were with Ontario Power Generation, but for a very brief period of time.
That's true.
Apparently, the current premier and his former chief of staff, Dean French, found out you were there, and Mr. French had you fired. Do you know what that's about?
I have no reason to believe that the premier had any knowledge or role in any of it. All I know about that episode is what Ontario Power Generation told me, and so my then manager at OPG, who has since left the company, told me of inappropriate interventions on the part of Mr. French, on the part of the chief of staff to the minister. That's what they told me about, and that's it. And so I left OPG about a week. Well, sorry, I was given notice of termination about a week or two after I started. There were various discussions that took place over the next few months about how I would leave, and ultimately we reached an amicable settlement, the certain details of which, under the agreement, I'm not allowed to disclose. But I'm completely free to discuss the period leading up to it.
Last thing on this, and that is that Doug Ford and Patrick Brown had a terrible relationship. They were rivals, and they didn't like each other at all. And you were clearly distanced and distancing yourself from Patrick Brown by the end. So I'm not sure why they would have had any animus towards you, since you were no more fond of Mr. Brown by the end than they were. Can you explain that?
Look, I think I am and have always been a supporter of the PC party. I'm a supporter of the Premier. I have no reason to believe the Premier was involved in any of this. In fact, I saw the Premier just a few months ago at Stampede in the summer. The way I describe my time working for Patrick Brown is it's sort of like being like Tom Cruise in The Firm, where you gradually realize the nature of the organization you're involved in and the people you're working with. My only real regret from that period isn't that I resigned on January, I think it was January 24th, but that I didn't resign several months sooner.
He's the mayor of Brampton today.
Yep.
Had none of that happened, he'd be the premier today.
All I can say is that I have zero regrets about resigning, other than that I didn't resign sooner. And I only really go to Brampton. I'm indifferent as to who is the mayor of Brampton. I only really go to Brampton en route to the airport.
We thank you for coming in, Alykhan Velshi, and talking to us both about Huawei and about the events of almost 2 years ago, which were, frankly, unprecedented in Ontario political history. Good to see you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.